What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? In this episode of the Simulator series, we are going to be creating the pet follow system. Now, as always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I have a Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I've made in this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's get right into it. So, hopping directly into Eating Simulator to see their pet follow system. Whenever we spawn in, all of our pets that we have equipped spawn in with us, and they do begin to follow us. Their rotation also does change depending on what our rotation currently is. And if we go inside of our pet inventory and we equip a new pet, we can see that that pet is now following us as well and positioned correctly. Additionally, if we unequip a pet, the pet is no longer following us. The same also goes if we delete a pet that's currently following us as well, that pet will stop following us. So now with the system explained, let's hop directly into Roblox Studio. So once we get into Roblox Studio, the first thing that we want to do is we want to go to the server script service and look inside of the pet script. Now inside of the script, we're going to create a brand new function towards the top of our script, and that is going to be called pet follow. Now this function is going to accept a player and a pet, which is actually going to be an instance. This instance is actually going to be the folder that's stored inside of the player's pet inventory, which includes all the information about the pet. Now the first thing we want to do inside of this function is we want to actually find the player's character. And the way that we're going to do that is by just saying player.character. Now we need to check if this character is actually existing. So we're going to say if not character, then return end. So stop the function right there if the character does not exist. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to either create a folder or check if the folder already exists inside of the player's character for where we're going to be storing the pet models that are going to be following the player. So we're going to say local pets folder equals character find first child pets, and that's going to be the name of the folder. And then what we want to do is we want to say if not pets folder. So if that folder was not found, then what we want to do is we want to actually create the folder. So we're going to say pets folder equals instance.new, and we're going to create a brand new folder, and we're going to parent that to the player's character. Then we're going to set the name of this folder to pets. And there we go. We've now created the folder, and we'll only ever create this one time. After that, the pets folder will be set right here because we will be able to find that folder within the character. Then the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the model of the pet that we have stored with inside of the replicated storage and inside of the pets folder. So we're going to say local pet model equals replicated storage dot pets find first child pet. And now remember, this is the instance that we created in the last episode. If you guys are a little bit confused about that, we can go inside of the utils folder and inside of the rewards module, and inside of here, this is one of the areas where we actually create this folder. So we have a folder, the name of that folder is the UUID of the pet, and then inside of that folder there are 2 string values and 1 bool value, and the string value that we're going to be using right now is the ID. Now I'm only showing you guys this to give you a reference back to the last episode when we actually created this, so hopefully you guys are not confused at all by what we're indexing or what we're getting when we actually look inside of the pet instance. So we're going to say pet.id to get the string value, and then we want to get the value of that ID because that will tell us the specific pet that we're looking for. And then once we actually find that model, what we then want to do is we want to clone it. Now that we have a clone of the pet model, what we then want to do is we want to set the position of the pet to the player's character. And now we're not getting the correct auto completion right here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually annotate the type of this pet model to a model to tell Studio that it is a model, which it will be. So then we can just type in P, and now we see the pivot to method, so we can use that. And now the target C frame that we want to use is the character.humanoid root part, make sure all the capitalizations are correct, and then .C frame. So now we set the position of the pet to the player. What we're now going to do is basically create the components which will move and rotate the pet around the player whenever the player moves. So we're going to create an attachment, and we're going to attach this to the character's humanoid root part. So we're going to say local character attachment equals instance.new attachment, and we're going to parent that to the character.humanoid root part. And we want to set this attachment visibility to false so that we don't actually see that. Now we're going to actually create another attachment, and this time we're actually going to attach that to the pet model's primary part. So what we can do is we can literally copy what we just did and rename this from character attachment to pet attachment. And of course we want to copy that variable down here. And now when we set the parent, once again, we want to set the parent to the pet model dot primary part. And the visibility is going to be false for this as well. Next, we want to actually create an align position. So we're going to say local align position equals instance.new align position, and this is going to be parented to the pet model. Then we have to set a couple of different properties of the align position. So the first one that we want to set is the max force, and we're going to set this to 25,000. And then we actually need to set both the attachment properties to the attachments that we just created. So we're going to say align position.attachment 0, and we're going to set that to the pet attachment. And then for the attachment 1, we're going to set that to the character attachment. Then we want to set the responsiveness of the align position, and we're going to set that to 25. Now we're done with the align position for right now. The next thing that we need to create is the align orientation. So we're going to say local align orientation equals instance.new align orientation. And once again, that's going to be parented to the pet model. Now we need to set some properties for this similar to the ones that we just set for the align position. So for the align orientation, we're going to set the max torque, and that's also going to be set to 25,000. And then once again, we need to set the attachments for this as well. So we're going to say align orientation dot attachment 0 equals pet attachment, and then align orientation dot attachment 1 equals character attachment. And then finally, we need to set the responsiveness of this, and that's also going to be to 25 as well. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an int value, which is going to hold a number based on the order that the pet was equipped in. Now, the reason that we're going to do this is because imagine that you're equipping a couple of different pets. Depending on how many pets you have equipped, you need to position each of the pets in a different position to prevent them all from being within the same exact position. So we can say local order equals instance.new int value and parent that to the pet model, and we're going to set the name of this int value to order. Now, to set the value of the order, we actually need to create a function so that we can figure out what number we want to set this pet's order to. So above the pet follow function, we're going to create a new function, and that's going to be called get pet order. And all we need is a character, which is of course going to be a model. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a variable for the pets folder, and we're going to set that equal to character dot pets. Now that we have the pets folder, what we first want to do is we want to check if there are any pets currently inside of this folder. If there are no pets inside of this folder, then we know automatically that the order should be 1 because that would be the first pet going into this folder. The way that we can do this is we can say if hashtag pet folder get children equals 0, then return 1. So if there are 0 children inside of the pets folder, then we're going to return 1 as the order. Now, if there are children inside of this folder, the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a variable for all of the active slots which are currently taken up. Then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the pets inside of the pet folder. So we're going to say pet folder get children do. Then we're going to get the order of the pet. So we're going to say local order equals pet.order.value, because remember, we just created that down here. We haven't set the value yet, but we're going to set the value based off this function. So don't worry about that. Dot value will exist. And then we want to use the order that we just got to set the active slots. So we're going to say active slots order equals order. So we're now tracking each of the orders and putting them inside of the active slots table. Then the next thing that we want to do is we want to create another for loop, and we're going to say for available slot, and this is going to be set to 1. I know, it's really weird using the standard for loop, but that's what we're going to be using for this. Then we have to identify the max amount of loops that this for loop can actually go through. So this should realistically be the max amount of pets that a player can actually have equipped, and I'm just going to set it to 5 for this example. Then we have to indicate how much we want to increase available slot by each loop, and we're going to say 1. Then we'll say do, and now we have our for loop created. Then what we want to do is we want to check if the active slot contains the available slot, which would be a number. So in the first loop, it would be 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then go all the way up to 5. And then the first number that active slots does not contain, we're going to return that available slot. So we're going to return that number. And we need to make sure that we say not active slot because we're looking to see if it doesn't exist. So now imagine if inside of active slots, the numbers are 1 and 3. Inside of this for loop, it's going to go through the first loop and it's going to say, okay, 1 exists, so we're not going to do anything. Then it's going to check if 2 exists inside of active slot. It's going to see that 2 does not exist, so that slot is free. And then it's going to return 2. So then we know that we're going to set the order value of this pet to that number. So then we can come back down to the pet follow function, and underneath where we set the name of the order instance, we can also set the value as well, and we're going to set that to get pet order, and all we have to do is pass through the player's character. So after we get the order, we actually have to set the position of the pet. Now what we're going to do is above the get order function, we're actually going to create a new table, and it's going to be called pet positions. Now this table is actually going to be an array, which is going to hold more tables. The tables inside of here are going to have 2 properties. The position property, and this is actually going to hold the position of where the pet should be, and the position is going to be a vector 3. And for the first position, we most likely want the pet directly behind the player. So we're going to say 0, 1, 10. And then the other property that this table is going to hold is orientation. And we're going to set that to, once again, a vector 3. And this is going to be 0, -90, 0. And now the orientation is the way that the pet is facing. And of course, the position is how far the pet is going to be from the player. And we will create more of these so that each pet that we have equipped can have its own position. But for now, we'll go back to the pet function and we'll actually set the pet's position. So we're going to say local pet position, and we're going to get that from the pet positions table that we just created. And we're actually going to index this table with the order.value that we just set. So now once we have the specific pet's position, what we're then going to do is we're going to set the character's attachment dot position to the pet positions pet.position. And then we're also going to set the character attachment.orientation to the pet positions.orientation. And now make sure that you're setting it to the variable that we just created and not to the table that we just created, which is what I did. So now that is set up correctly. Then finally, what we're going to do is we need to set the pet model.name to the actual UUID of the pet so that we can easily find it in case we want to destroy it. And now remember, the UUID would be the name of this pet. So we're going to say pet.name. And then we also need to set the parent of the model as well. So pet model.parent equals the pet folder that we just created. And then lastly, we need to set the network ownership of this pet. So we're going to say pet model.primary part set network owner, and we're going to set that to the player. Okay, so we now have the pet follow function basically created. Then we actually need to call this function. And when are we going to call this function? Well, whenever we actually equip a pet, which we have a comment laid out right here for us. So we're going to say pet follow, and we'll pass through the player and the pet instance. Now let's go ahead and start our game and test this function out. So now when we hop into our game, let's go ahead and equip this cat pet, and we can see that the pet actually does appear behind us and it is following us. So we can tell that this is working perfectly. So now that we know that this pet is following us successfully, the next thing that we need to actually do is set up more pet positions so that we can equip more pets. So going back to the pet positions, let's talk about the position currently. Now if you're unaware of how vector 3s work, this is the X, this is the Y, and this is the Z. The Y usually indicates up and down, the X usually indicates left or right, and then the Z usually indicates basically forward or behind the character. So the reason that this is at 10 is because this means that the pet appears 10 studs behind the player. If we set this to 5, then the pet would actually appear 5 studs behind the player, so this would be closer to the player. Now if we want to make the pet higher up off of the ground and higher above the player, we could set this to 5, and they would probably be much higher than the player currently is. So now that we understand how the position works, let's talk about the orientation. The orientation is what the pet is currently facing, and we figured out that the Y value of the vector 3 basically makes the pet look left or right. And the reason that we have the orientation set to -90 degrees is because we have the pet behind the player, so we need to set the orientation for the pet to be facing the player. Now you can easily modify these numbers to work with it yourself and learn more about the orientation and the position, but I have a list of my own preset positions and orientations which will work, so that's what we're going to use for now. So for the second pet position, we can just copy and paste this, and now all we have to do is modify a little bit of the position and the orientation. So for the second and the third pet, we most likely want those to appear behind the player as well, one to the left and one to the right. So when the player has all 3 pets equipped, one is directly behind them and one is to the left and the right behind them as well. So for this to work, we are going to set the X to -7.5. The Y is going to stay the same. The Z is actually going to be a little bit smaller, and this is going to be set to 8. Then we also need to change the rotation a little bit because we need it to be rotated a little bit more. So we're going to set that to -120. Then for the third position, we want this pet to be on the other side. So like, let's say for instance, if the second position is on the left of the player, we want this to be on the right of the player. So instead of saying -7.5, we can actually set this to a +7.5. And then for the orientation, we want this to be at -60. So when the pet directly behind the player is looking at the player, the orientation is set to -90. Then when the pet is on the left, we add 30 degrees to this, so it's a little bit more tilted towards the player, and that will equal 120. And then when the pet is on the other side, we need to subtract 30 degrees from the original 90, and that's why we set this to -60. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. Then we can go ahead, start up our game, and test out the 3 new positions. So let's go ahead and unequip each of the pets, and then let's go ahead and equip all 3. So we have 1, we have 2, and we have 3. And as we can see, they're all positioned pretty nicely, but we actually have to adjust this one's orientation. The other 2 look pretty nice, and as we can see, we can move around with them, and they're all good. Yes, as you can see, some parts of the pet are falling apart and falling off of the pet when they spawn in, but don't worry, we'll get to that in a second. So I made a mistake, and I forgot to change this from -120 to 160, even though I just explained it. But now that it's at -60, it will be facing the correct way whenever we use that third slot. So now let's go ahead and solve that issue that we had where some of the pet's parts actually fall off of the pet when we spawn the pet in. The way that we're going to do that is by going into wherever the pets are actually stored at, going into their models. Then for each of the pets, we have to select all of the mesh parts that it's made of, and we have to set the can collide and can touch property to false. We can also set the can query. So basically all of the can properties under the collision category, we want to set those to false for all of the mesh parts of each of the pets. You could even turn cast shadow off as well if you wanted to, but you don't need to. So then we're going to select all the pets and do this for every single one of their mesh parts. So then once we set the properties for each of the pets, we now need to actually weld the pet parts to the pet so that those parts don't fall off of the pet when we spawn them in. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we understand which part is the primary part of the model. And for instance, we set the primary part of each of the pets to the part that has the decal inside of it. So I know what the primary part is for all the pets. Then inside of all of the other parts of the pet, what we need to do is we need to actually add a weld constraint. Then for the weld constraint, we want to set the part 0 property to the primary part of the pet. So we can click part 0 and then click the primary part. And then for part 1, we want to actually set that to the part that the weld constraint was created inside of. So that part right there. Then what we can do is we can duplicate this weld constraint by hitting Control D, drag it down to the part below that. We don't have to touch part 0 because that's already set to the primary part. But what we then need to do is we then need to click on the part 1 and set that to the new part that we just put the weld constraint inside of. So we can do that once again, only changing part 1 to the new part. And then we have to do this for every single part, and we have to do this for every single pet. So then inside of the cat, we have the weld constraint. Let's make sure that we set part 0 to the primary part and part 1 to the part that the weld constraint is inside of, and do this for every single part. All right, there we go. Once you have all the weld constraints in each of the different parts except for the primary part, you're good to go, and we don't have to touch the models anymore. What we can actually do is we can start up the game and test out that these changes have worked successfully. So we can go into our game, unequip a pet, and equip a pet, and now we can see all of the parts are actually still attached to that pet, so we know that we set up the welds all correctly. The next thing that we need to script up is the pet unfollowing the player whenever they unequip it. So what we're going to do is create a new function above the pet follow function, and this is going to be called pet unfollow, and this is going to accept a player and the pet UUID, which is going to be a string. And inside of here, we're going to need to get the character of the player. So we're going to say local character equals player.character, and we're going to do the same thing. If the character doesn't exist, then we're just going to stop the function right there. Then we need to actually find the pet. So we're going to create a variable called pet, and we're going to set that to the character. And then inside of the character, we're going to have the pets folder. So we're going to say character.pets, and we use the find first child method on this, and we're going to be looking for the pet UUID, because remember, when we set the pet to follow the player, the name of the pet is the UUID of the pet. That's why we set it to that name, so we can easily find it. And then we should mostly always find this pet, but what we're going to do is we're going to say if not pet, in case we don't find it for some reason, then we're just going to return n and stop the function right there. Otherwise, if we do find the pet, then we can simply destroy it. So now that we have that function set up, all we have to do is actually call this function, and we call that whenever we unequip the pet, which is going to be inside of the pet equip function. So right here where we unequip the pet, we're going to say pet unfollow and pass through the player and the pet.name, which would be the UUID. So now if we start up our game, we're going to experience an error. It's only happening because we're not actually setting the pets to follow the player when they join the game. We're just testing out the unequip and equip feature real quick. So now that we've clicked unequip, it will actually unequip the pet. Then we can click the unequip button again, and this will equip the pet. So we can see that we have the pet following us. If we click unequip and unequip the pet stops following us. And if we click equip again, we can see that it starts following us again. So this is working perfectly. Now, the other time that the pet should stop following us is whenever we actually delete the pet. So we're also going to call the pet unfollow function inside of the pet delete function as well. So right before we actually destroy the pet instance, what we need to do is we need to call that pet unfollow function, and we're going to pass through the player and the UUID, which is an argument of this function. The next thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the pets to follow the player whenever the player joins the game or if they respawn, because whenever the player dies, the character is actually affected by that. So we need to make sure the pets start following the player once they respawn as well. What we first have to do is we have to actually get the player's service. So we're just going to copy and paste that, say players, and create a variable for the player service. Then down here, we're going to say players.playerAdded connect function player, which is a player. And then since we're getting the player whenever they join the game, we can listen to the character added event as well. And we're going to connect that to another function, and that will give us the player's character. Now, this character added function, we're actually listening to whenever the player respawns as well as when they first join the game. So we've got both those scenarios covered. Now we have to actually get the pets to follow the player. The thing is, though, is that when the player first spawns into the game, they might not actually be parented to the workspace, which is needed for our function to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called seconds, and we're going to set that to 0, and we're going to use a repeat loop, and what we're going to repeat is task.wait1. So we're going to wait 1 second, and we're going to say seconds plus equals 1. So we add 1 to our seconds variable every second. And now what we need to happen is we need for the character.parent.name to be equal to workspace, so that we know that the player is actually parented to the workspace, or seconds equals 10. And if seconds equals 10, something probably bad's going on. The player might be really laggy or completely disconnected from the game, so we don't want this loop to go infinitely. That's why we're giving this loop 10 seconds to run, or if the character gets parented to the workspace, which should happen 99% of the time. So then once we know that the character is a part of the workspace, what we then want to do is we actually want to spawn in all of the players' equipped pets. Now, how do we get all the players' equipped pets? Well, remember, all the pets are stored within inside of the pets inventory folder. So we're going to say local pets folder equals player, find first child, pet inventory. Now that we have that folder, we can go ahead and loop through it. So we're going to say for underscore pet in iPairs, pets folder, get children, do. Then we're going to check if the pet is equipped. So if pet.equipped.value, then, and we can then call the pet follow function on the player and pass through the pet instance as well. So now let's go ahead, start our game, and test this out. So we can see as soon as we spawn into our game, all of our pets are actually equipped, which should be. Then if we want to, we can go inside of here, equip another pet, and we can see that pet is positioned perfectly. They all follow us and everything's all good. Then what we can do is we can reset the character. So we kill the character, and whenever the character respawns, we can see that all the pets are equipped once again, meaning this is all working perfectly. So ladies and gentlemen, the pet follow system is complete, and hopefully this video did help you guys out. If it did, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn those post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.